A marathon is 26.2 miles. It is one of the events in the Olympics, and you probably never have heard of the name that I'm about to tell you, but his name is Vanderlei de Lima. He was a Brazilian marathoner, and he was competing in the 2004 Summer Olympics, which were held in Greece. And he was attempting to be the first Brazilian marathoner to win the marathon in this event. He was not a favorite. He was not picked to win at all. He was pretty obscure. But at about the 13-mile mark, which is about the halfway mark, de Lima gets into the lead. He takes the lead. He's in first place. And over the next 9 miles, he just continues to just push and pull away and surprising everyone. Well, you come to the 22-mile mark. He has about a 30-second lead, which is a very significant lead. I mean, he looks like this guy is going to get it. He's only got 4 miles to go. He's got 22 miles under his belt. And wow, he is going to do it. And then all of a sudden, with a 30-second lead, first place, someone out of the crowd just attacks him, tackles him, and pushes him off to the side. Pushes him into the crowd, and security comes, and there's people in the crowd that are helping him up, and they get the attacker off of him, and he's able to get back into the race. He gets back into the race. And he's still in first place, but his lead is shrunk significantly. It's a close race. It wasn't close before. Now it's close. He continues and he tries to continue on, and he's passed by a runner, and now he's in second, and then he's passed again, and he finishes third place. So unfortunate that he was having such a good race, and then something out of the crowd. Some outside force, some external factor, and I hope you can see where I'm going with this, has an effect on him. He is in a rhythm, he's in focus, and that is where I want you to see today is that these runners, it requires such focus, such mental concentration to be able to run that far and continue on. I mean, you get into a state of almost where you have to just block out everything, and you're focused on just picking up one foot in front of the other, and you get into that rhythm, and you get this focus, and you're just in another world. Well, when the man jumps out and tackles him, his focus is gone. His rhythm is just destroyed. If you will, take your copy of God's Word and open it to Hebrews chapter 12, and I want to talk about that today, about this thing of rhythm and this thing of focus that's required to run the race. If you know much about the book of Hebrews, you'll know that in chapter 11, it's called the Hall of Faith, right? Kind of a little cutesy play on words with Hall of Fame. But we call chapter 11 the Hall of Faith. You see there at the beginning, there's a little description in verse 1 of chapter 11. And if you're right there in the neighborhood, just go ahead and turn back with me, and you'll be able to scan along with me in chapter 11. Some of you are very familiar with chapter 11, called the Hall of Faith. But in the first verse, there's somewhat of a definition. I'm not sure if we should call it a definition, but it's a description of what faith is. And then he follows, you see in verse 1, now faith is, you see that, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That is, I don't believe that's a comprehensive definition, so that's why I'm hesitant to tell you there's the definition of faith. I think what the writer is doing, though, here in chapter 11 and then leading up into chapter 12 is that he's trying to help you understand what faith is, so that when we live our life and we're following Jesus, we'll have some idea of what faith is. Then he comes in the rest of the chapter, and he gives these Old Testament saints. He just lists one after the other. If you look at For example, in verse 4 of chapter 11, it says, by faith Abel. And then you drop down and he says, by faith Enoch, and by faith Noah. And verse 8, by faith Abraham and Sarah. And on and on and on. He just goes and gives all these different examples of how these different people lived out the life of faith. Well, he comes there in chapter 12, and then he is going to give us some exhortation. We've seen all the examples. We've seen how faith is lived out. And then you come to chapter 12, and here is the exhortation. Here is the urging to action and the application. That might be the best way to say it. The application of what we've just seen. And in chapter 12, in verse 1, let me read verses 1 through 3, and if you will, follow along with me. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. The writer of Hebrews now is coming after he gives instruction on faith, with providing us with the need for endurance. He is telling us that there is going to be things in your life, the external factors that come along after you're saved. So before I begin, before I get into my first point, before you post that first point, hold up. Because I'm going to tell you how to start the race. But first of all, let me tell you, before we do that, let me tell you what you have to do to be qualified to enter the race. Some of you may have entered a competition before of some kind. And there are always certain qualifications before you can enter the competition. And I want to tell you that the qualification for entering this race is, first of all, you must be saved. I don't want in any way at all, you are sadly mistaken if you think that running this race is how to be saved. That's not what it's talking about. We're not talking about how to be saved. We're talking about how you live the life after you're saved. This is we can call this a journey of faith. That's fine, because a life is a journey, isn't it? But this isn't how to be saved. The first qualification to even sign up and enter the race, y'all don't believe in salvation by works, do you? I hope not. I hope you don't think that there's anything left for you to do to procure your salvation. You're not living this life in order and working to earn or merit your salvation. When Jesus was on the cross and He said, "It is finished," everything that was required for a person to be saved was finished by the work of Jesus on the cross. He died for you. He is the one who shed His blood, and that was the ultimate sacrifice that satisfied God's requirement for the paying the debt of sin on your part. You cannot pay the debt. That if we're not there yet, the rest of this is not going to make any sense. You have a debt that you could not pay. Guess what? Jesus paid it. That's the qualification for entering the race. So when He's talking about here in chapter 12, and He's talking about we are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, and let us run the race. He's talking about us living the Christian life. This is what it's called a metaphor. It's a literary device. It's something that is used to set alongside something as a comparison for you to understand something else. And the metaphor here is running a race. And running the race is living out your faith, living out the Christian life. And so look at what he says. And so here we go. Number one, starting the race. Starting the race. Look at the first verse here. He says, we also. He had just finished talking about all these Old Testament heroes of faith. And now he turns his attention back to you, back to the reader. And he says, we also. And he does that to cheer you on and get you to see that, listen now, we need to come together and we need to apply this message that we have heard. And he says, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. These heroes of faith in chapter 11 are witnesses, are testimonies for us to look at to see what it's like to live a life of faith. There's all kinds of stories in chapter 11 and stories behind the stories in chapter 11. But these are these Old Testament examples. And he's reminding us, follow their examples. Follow their examples as you live out this life of faith. There's a lot of lessons there, a lot of valuable things to look at and consider from chapter 11. So that's the reference there, a whole host of witnesses. And here is what he says to do. He says, lay aside every weight. Let me go back to the metaphor of running a race for just a minute. And when you look at some of these athletes in the Olympics, you'll see that they're not wearing a lot of clothes. Have you noticed that? You know, I'm not going to go around dressed like them. I understand why they're dressed like that, and the reason is because they're laying aside every weight. They're removing anything that might encumber them and hinder them as they compete and strive for mastery, strive for the medals that they're trying to win, strive to win and compete against others. They remove everything. You don't see a marathoner show up in cowboy boots and blue jeans, do you? If they do, it's going to be very difficult for them to run 26 miles in cowboy boots and blue jeans. That's just probably not going to work. You're not going to see them jump in the pool and try to swim with cowboy boots and blue jeans. That ain't going to work either. So they are laying aside every weight. And they come to this race here in the best shape possible and in the best condition possible. Dear friend, I don't know about you, but you've probably noticed that these athletes, these that are striving to compete, they put their whole heart into it. I mean, nothing else matters. It is what their life is about. And that's a very, very important comparison for us to make here when we're talking about living the Christian life. You're supposed to remove everything else that might get in the way. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying lay aside every weight. And he says, this is interesting because as he says, lay aside every weight, and then he says, and the sin, and then he describes the sin, that sin easily ensnares us. You see that in chapter 1? And so are we talking about two things? Lay aside every weight and the sin. Well, what is it just sin and he is leading up to it, or are there two different things? I'm going to leave you with a little thought here, is that sometimes there's things in our life that are obvious, like sin. It's obvious. There's some things that we do, there's some bad habits, there's some attitudes that just boil down to it's plain old sin, and he's saying lay aside. Lay aside all these things that are just obvious. That's the sin in your life. Did you know that once you're a child of God doesn't mean that you don't sin anymore? I get at this point in my life, I'm starting to become amused with lost people who attack believers by calling us hypocrites. Well, they don't know what they're talking about, and maybe there's some believers out here that are giving the wrong idea to unbelievers, but I'm going to tell you something, believers are sinners. They're sinners. We're not above anyone. Now, we are heaven bound. We have rewards in heaven. We are chosen. We are loved by God. All of those things. That's true. We are set apart. We are sanctified. We are holy. We are all those things. But on a person-to-person level, I'm going to tell you that a believer needs to be humble in himself to not come across as a hypocrite. Don't act like you don't have sin in your life, because all of us do. All of us have some type of challenge. All of us have some type of thing in their life. I don't know what it is. And honestly, unless you want to tell me, I don't want to know what it is. That's between you and the Lord. Now, if you ever want to talk to me about it, I'll try to give you some help, but that's between you and the Lord. People struggle with sin. Believers struggle with sin. Well, what is this other thing here? When he says, lay aside every weight and the sin. What is the every weight? What could he be talking about? I'm going to tell you what I think he means. I think he means things that are not so obvious. There's been some things in my life that I have not noticed about myself. I'm thankful that as I go and as I've matured, that God has shown me some things about myself that I wasn't even aware of that I need to get corrected. Some things that could hold me back. Some things that could hinder me. And so I do think that it's very good here to probably distinguish between lay aside every weight, maybe some things that are subtle in your life. Maybe they're not so obvious in your life. God's going to show you that those things are a hindrance and you need to get rid of them. And then there's some things that you know about. There's some things that you know about it because you feel guilty about it. Have you ever been there in that where you're just overwhelmed with guilt? Overwhelmed, and I'm a little reluctant and hesitant to put it this way, but I hope that you'll forgive me. I hope it doesn't offend you. Is that it makes us not like ourselves. It makes us kind of hate ourselves. Oh, I wish I wasn't like that, and I feel guilty. And then you come to God, and you're so ashamed, and you're full of guilt. Dear friend, lay it at the feet of Jesus. It ain't news to Him. He already knew that you do these things and you struggle with these things. The best thing to do is confess, admit, and ask for help. He says, lay aside all these things. Get rid of the hindrances from your life, because you're not going to be able to run to the full potential and run this Christian life, run the race of the Christian life effectively if you're just overwhelmed and burdened by sin. Well, look what he says there, and he says, let us run. Now, slow down, run with endurance, and I want you to process that. Run with endurance. Very important what he's saying here, isn't it? Because the running of the race is not going to be you are saved and you're done. That's not it. You're not done. Now you're qualified to begin the race. And now God is telling you, you have a race to run. There is a race for you to run. And He says, if you're going to do this, if you're going to follow Jesus, if you're going to live the Christian life, it must be with endurance. Well, that tells me something. It tells me if I need endurance, the race is not short, and the race is not going to be easy. It's going to require strength. Literally, that word there, it means to endurance, it means to hold up under a load. Hold up under a load. After you become saved, your problems are not over. In fact, if you were listening in 1 Peter, you'll remember that your problems are just beginning. After you're saved, the world is going to hate you. After you're saved, the world is going to persecute you. After you're saved, you're going to suffer things because of who you are. Because you are saved, you're going to suffer. And he says, run with endurance. You're going to need endurance to run the race. Now here's the second thing. Run with endurance, because the race is a lifetime right? It's a lifetime, not a sprint. It's like a marathon, isn't it? But the second thing is this in verse 1. It's the race that is set before us. There's a lot of independent-minded believers out there. And I'm going to tell you, one of the biggest mistakes you could ever make is think that this is a race course that you get to design. It is designed by God. What that is called is following Jesus. Now, I'm not trying to be funny. Following Jesus. Some people think that when they're saved, now they get to go and do whatever they want and get involved in anything they want. Now, the Lord may open up doors for you, but there's sometimes where the Lord is going to close a door. And I might do it in a couple of weeks. I want to continue on in chapter 12 because he talks about discipline. Sometimes God is going to tell you no. If you ever enter a race, you'll know that there's boundaries, right? There's rules. There are lines that you have to stay between. The marathoner that I was just mentioning, he had to follow the course that was set by the Olympic Committee. He didn't get to say, well, I'd like to go up here and take a right because I'm better at running a hill than some of these other ones, and I want a hilly course. I can beat these guys if we have a hilly course. Someone else says, no, let's take a left up here because it will work into my strengths. I'm going to tell you, we don't get those choices sometimes. God says, this is the way you go, and you follow God. What are we thinking, right? Following Jesus means following Jesus. It is the race that is set before us. Now, number two. That's how you start the race. Number two, how do you finish the race? Look at verse 2 and what he says here. Looking unto Jesus. That's how you finish the race. First of all, you look to Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate example. I like what he does here because he gives us all these Old Testament saints. Gives us all these examples, all these stories about the Old Testament, the faithful saints of the Old Testament. And then he says, when he gives you the application, he reminds you of that in verse 1, but in verse 2, then he pivots to Jesus. Those may have been good examples, but he says this in verse 2, the ultimate example is Jesus. When you're running the race, if you're running any kind of race, you have to stay focused, don't you? That Vanderlei de Lima, he was running, and there's a quote, and I should have copied and pasted it and put it into my notes and read it to you. But he said something like this. He said, I was just so concentrated on my race. I was in a rhythm. He said, I was doing so well, and then I was surprised. Does that sound like your life? Sounds like my life. Everything's going well. I'm doing well. It feels like I'm doing well. I'm strong. I'm moving along. And then out of left field, here comes that attacker. Well, we looked at it in 1 Peter. His name is Satan, isn't he? He's like a lion that's roaming around, seeking whom he may devour. Dear friend, there's going to be things that happen to you, external factors that are going to happen to you while you're running the race. And we're reminded here in verse 2 to look to Jesus. Look to Jesus. Because we may at times begin to grow weary, right? We are going to be surprised. We're going to be our focus is going to be totally knocked out. Our rhythm is going to be totally disturbed, and we're going to stumble in the race. But he says, look to Jesus. And then he gives this description about Jesus. He says that Jesus, first of all, is the author and finisher of our faith. Interesting words here. The word author can mean pioneer, can mean trailblazer, it can mean leader, it can mean champion. That's all those translations are fit that Greek word. Finisher, it can mean completer. Jesus is the only one who's ever finished the race and done it perfectly. That is who you need to look to. That's why he says that. Oh, you can look to Abraham, but I'm going to promise you this. Abraham will disappoint you when you start learning more about Abraham. Amen? For those of you who know anything about Abraham, he was kind of a disappointing guy at times. One that we could admire at times. One we could look up to. But I promise you this, Jesus never disappointed. Never disappointed. He is the champion. He is the pioneer. He's the one who we follow on this race. That's why he says that. He's the author and the finisher of our faith. The finisher, the completer. He is the source of our faith because He died and was resurrected. He is the goal of our faith because He was obedient to the Father. Now here in a couple of weeks, if we go on into this, I'm praying about it. I don't know how the Lord is going to lead me. We may go into the rest of chapter 12. But this thing about discipline, that's what he's talking about here, is obedience. He's talking about submitting to the will of the Father. Jesus submitted to the will of the Father. You say, well, why are you saying that right now? I want to show you. Look at the next couple of phrases. Because he says, who, in talking about Jesus, for the joy that was set before Him, endured the cross. What was the joy? What was the joy? When Jesus looked at the cross and said, ooh, is that joy or not? I'm going to tell you, it was because Jesus valued the joy of completing the race. He had a greater value for running the race and completing the race. His value was higher. He valued that over the shame. He said, the joy that it will bring for me to die on the cross outweighs the cost of the shame. We can't forget about the shame, can we? Dying on the cross. What a shame! That's shameful. It's humiliating. It was the worst kind of death. It was the worst in a public spectacle in that sense, and it was also the most painful way. But Jesus said, you know what? The joy of finishing this race, and His race is different than yours. He was obtaining salvation for the world. When He went to the cross, that brought Jesus joy. Hold your thought there. And that's why He endured the cross. It was the joy that enabled Him to endure the cross. He despised the shame, but look at this. In the end, Jesus is exalted. At the end of that verse, you'll see that He has sat down at the right hand of God. That's a place of honor. That's a place of victory. That's a place of triumph. That is a place of exaltation. Jesus was honored and lifted up because He endured the cross. Now, I'm not saying this because I want us to all have this attitude that oh yeah, we want to be lifted up. We want to be honored. We want to be exalted. But here's what you can look forward to. Is as you live this thing of the Christian life, there's some things about suffering that you're going to despise. There's some things about the shame that you'll have to go through. Loss of status. Maybe even loss of material possessions in this life. The suffering that comes along with it. But dear friend, look to Jesus as the example who looked past the shame, looked past the suffering, and could see the triumph at the end. We could see victory at the end. Amen? Can you see victory at the end? Amen. Of course you can. Now look at this in verse 3. And He gives you it's an imperative. It's a command. And He tells you that you must do this. Consider Him. That word consider, it's a mathematical word, by the way. It's one where you tally up things. It's a reckoning. It's an accounting term. Where an accountant will have his or her ledger. And at the end of it, everything will be tallied up. And there is a reckoning. And he says this, for consider him, or reckon him, consider him in deep thought and reflection, who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. Let me start at the end of that verse, and then I want to come back around. But this thing of weariness, this thing of discouragement deep in your souls, you may be there today. You may be weary. You may be tired. I don't know if you can imagine, though, maybe an athlete that is in the final parts of his or her race. And they're running and they're weary. And you can tell by looking at them that they don't look as good as they did at the beginning of the race. They're starting to give out, and their form is not good anymore. They're tired. Dear friend, running the Christian race can be tiring. But here's where I want you to think about what he's doing. He's saying, consider Jesus. He's saying, again, look to Jesus. Go back to Jesus. When you are weary, when you are discouraged, look at the model of Jesus in your life. And he says this, he endured the hostility from sinners against himself. Where does our discouragement come? It comes because we live in a world that's full of sin. It comes because we're surrounded by sinners. There's sometimes, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but you can get discouraged almost incidentally. Weary incidentally. And what I'm talking about is this. Sometimes things around you discourage you, and there was no intention on anyone else's part to discourage you, but you got discouraged. The bottom line is, I don't know whose fault it is. I don't know if it's anyone's fault. I don't know if they meant to. It was unintentional, but the bottom line is, I'm just discouraged. You know what? That is normal for a person in this life who walks on this earth to become discouraged and tired. But he says this, consider him. Consider him who for the joy, and I'm up in verse 2 now again, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. He endured because of the joy of being obedient to his Father. Let me close with this. Jesus, as I mentioned a while ago, and if our musicians would come, we'll prepare for a song of invitation. Jesus is the source and the goal of our faith. And in your life, you're going to stumble. I hope I made the point abundantly clear. There are no perfect Christians. There are no perfect believers. Many times, over and over again, you're going to stumble. Does that mean you're lost? No, I don't think it means you're lost. I think what it means is you're human. You have a human nature. And in this human body, this human nature, even still that you're redeemed, you still have sin in your life and you're able to sin. You're going to stumble. You're going to knock yourself down sometimes. Sometimes others are going to knock you down. But dear friend, the key is this. Look to Jesus. Aren't you thankful for Jesus? I'm thankful that Jesus not only endured the cross, even though it was shameful, but there was joy on the other side of it. I'm thankful for that. But I'm also thankful for this. I'm thankful for a compassionate Jesus, a forgiving Jesus, a Jesus that saved me despite the fact that He knew down the road, as I run the race, I was going to fall down. I was going to get pushed off the course. I was going to stumble. And then even in the attempting to get back up, I'm still stumbling. I'm still messing it up, as we might say. Sometimes I think we mess it up. And dear friend, you hadn't messed nothing up. You know why? Because Jesus says it's finished. Jesus says it's finished. Oh, you're saved. You're saved. But faithfulness to finish the race. If He saved you, He will also help you when you stumble. He's the finisher of our faith. If you will, let's stand and have a song of invitation.